I remember the exact moment when I stopped being a mother and became a strategist instead. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, unseasonably warm for Boston, and I was standing in my kitchen arranging flowers I'd just bought from the farmer's market when I noticed my daughter's car pull into our driveway at 2 in the afternoon on what should have been a workday for her. I watched through the window as she checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, applied fresh lipstick with the kind of careful attention a woman only gives when she's about to see a man she wants to impress, and then walked toward our house with a confidence that made my stomach turn because I recognized it as the walk of a woman who knows she's desired. My husband Richard had told me that morning he'd be working from home, something he'd been doing more frequently over the past 6 months, and as I stood there with a bunch of sunflowers in my hands, watching my 32-year-old daughter let herself in through our front door with the key we'd given her for emergencies, I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that my marriage and my motherhood were about to collide in the most devastating way possible. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment sharing where you're from. Your support truly means everything to me. My name is Margaret, though everyone has always called me Maggie. I'm 75 years old now, living in a comfortable townhouse in Cambridge, Massachusetts, far from the sprawling colonial in Brookline where this story begins. I was born in 1949 in a small town in Connecticut, the youngest of 4 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family where loyalty and family came before everything else. Those values shaped every decision I made in my life, right up until the moment I discovered they meant nothing to the 2 people I loved most in the world. I met Richard when I was 23 years old, fresh out of nursing school and working the night shift at Massachusetts General Hospital. He was a resident in cardiology, brilliant and ambitious, with dark hair that fell across his forehead when he was concentrating and a smile that made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. He came from old Boston money, the kind of family with a summer house on the Cape and ancestors who came over on the Mayflower, but he never acted entitled or superior. He was kind to the nurses, remembered everyone's names, and worked harder than anyone else. We were married within a year, a quick courtship that scandalized his family and delighted mine. I was pregnant with our daughter Catherine within 6 months of the wedding. Those early years were hard in the way that all young marriages are hard, with Richard working 80-hour weeks as a new attending physician and me at home with a colicky baby in a tiny apartment in Brighton. But we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Richard was devoted to his work and to our growing family. We had 2 more children, twin boys named Michael and Patrick, when Catherine was 3. I gave up nursing when the twins were born. Richard's practice was thriving by then, and we could afford for me to stay home. I threw myself into motherhood with the same intensity I'd once brought to my nursing career. I was room mother, PTA president, the mom who hosted every birthday party and baked cookies for every bake sale. Our house in Brookline was always full of children, laughter, noise. Richard worked long hours but came home to a warm house, well-fed children, a wife who still looked good and ran everything smoothly. Catherine was my firstborn, my only daughter, and I loved her with a ferocity that sometimes scared me. She was beautiful from birth, with Richard's dark hair and my green eyes, a combination that made strangers stop us on the street. But it wasn't just her looks. Catherine was charismatic, magnetic even as a child. She could walk into a room and every eye would turn to her. She was smart, quick-witted, talented at everything she tried. Dance, piano, academics, sports. She excelled at all of it with seemingly no effort. I was so proud of her. Every mother says that about her daughter, I know, but with Catherine it felt different, special. She was going places, I was sure of it. And when she got accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, when she graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business, when she landed a prestigious job at a consulting firm in Boston, I felt like all my sacrifices had been worth it. I had raised an extraordinary woman. The boys were different, easier in some ways. Michael became a teacher, married his college sweetheart Sarah, gave me 2 beautiful grandchildren. Patrick went into finance, moved to New York, visited on holidays. They were good sons, solid and dependable. But Catherine was the star, the one who shone brightest, the one everyone noticed. Richard and Catherine had always been close. He'd missed so much of the boys' childhood because of his work schedule, but by the time Catherine was a teenager, his practice was established enough that he had more time at home. He attended all her swim meets, helped her with her college applications, gave her advice about her career. I was happy they had such a strong relationship. I thought it was beautiful, the bond between father and daughter. Looking back now, I can see signs I missed or chose not to see. The way Catherine would light up when Richard came home, more than seemed normal even for a daddy's girl. The way Richard would always take Catherine's side in any family disagreement. The private jokes they shared that excluded me. The times I'd find them in Richard's study, heads bent close together over something on his computer, and they'd both look slightly guilty when I walked in. But I trusted them. That was my mistake. I trusted my husband of 35 years and my daughter completely and absolutely. Even when my friends would comment on how unusual their closeness seemed, how Catherine at 32 still called her father multiple times a day, I defended them. I said it was wonderful that they had such a strong relationship, that so many daughters lost touch with their fathers. I was proud of their bond. The affair had been going on for 6 months before I discovered it. 6 months of lies and betrayal happening right under my nose, in my own house, in the bed I shared with my husband. Looking back, I realized there were signs everywhere. Richard's sudden interest in working from home more often. Catherine's increasingly frequent visits, always when the boys were unlikely to stop by. The way they'd both become secretive with their phones, angling the screens away when I came near. But that Tuesday in October, standing in my kitchen with those sunflowers, watching Catherine walk into my house with that particular walk, something in my gut told me to stay quiet and observe. Instead of calling out a greeting like I normally would, instead of going to the front hall to welcome my daughter, I stayed in the kitchen and listened. I heard Catherine's heels clicking on the hardwood floor of the foyer. I heard her call out softly, asking if anyone was home. And then I heard Richard's voice, coming from upstairs, from our bedroom, telling her to come up. There was something in his tone, intimate and warm, that a wife knows belongs only to lovers. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put down the flowers before I dropped them. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me wanted to storm upstairs, to catch them, to scream and cry and demand explanations. But something stopped me. A voice in my head, cold and calculating, told me to be smart about this. To gather evidence. To know exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. I set down the flowers and very quietly took my purse from the counter. I had my phone, my wallet, my keys. I walked out the back door, got in my car, and drove away. I drove for hours, not really seeing where I was going, just driving. Through neighborhoods I'd lived in for decades, past the park where I'd pushed Catherine on the swings, past the high school where she'd graduated valedictorian. By the time I came home that evening, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them yet. I wasn't going to fall apart or make a scene. I was going to be smart and patient and thorough. I was going to find out everything, document everything, and then when I was ready, when I had all the power, I would destroy them both. Richard was in his study when I got home, working on his laptop like nothing had happened. Catherine's car was gone. He looked up when I came in, smiled that familiar smile, asked how my day had been. I smiled back and lied just as easily as he was lying. I said it had been fine, just errands and groceries. He kissed my cheek and went back to his work. That night, after Richard fell asleep, I took his phone. I knew his passcode. We'd never had secrets, or so I thought. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. Texts between Richard and Catherine going back 6 months, increasingly intimate, increasingly explicit. Plans to meet when I was out. Expressions of love that made me want to vomit. Photos I will never be able to unsee. But more than that, I found something that changed everything. A discussion about me. About how I was getting older, how Richard felt trapped, how Catherine understood him in ways I never could. Catherine saying she'd always loved him, not as a father but as a man. Richard saying he'd felt the same way about her for years but had never acted on it until 6 months ago when they'd had too much wine at a family dinner and something just happened. Something just happened. As if betrayal could be accidental, as if you could trip and fall into your own daughter's bed, into your own father's arms. Reading those words, I felt something inside me break and then immediately harden into something cold and sharp. The Maggie who had been a devoted wife and loving mother died in that moment. What replaced her was someone I didn't recognize but who I would come to know very well over the next decade. I took screenshots of everything. Every text, every photo, every damning piece of evidence. I uploaded them to a cloud storage account Richard didn't know about. Then I carefully put his phone back exactly where he'd left it and lay down beside him in our bed, staring at the ceiling while he snored peacefully next to me. The next morning, I acted completely normal. I made Richard's breakfast, kissed him goodbye when he left for the hospital, called Catherine to chat about nothing in particular. She sounded slightly strained on the phone, probably feeling guilty, but she played along. We talked about her work, about whether she'd be coming to Sunday dinner. She said yes, of course, she wouldn't miss it. That's when I knew exactly what kind of people they were. They could betray me in the most fundamental way possible and then sit at my dinner table, eat my food, look me in the eye and pretend everything was fine. They had no intention of coming clean, of ending it, of sparing me any pain. They were going to keep their affair going indefinitely, right under my nose, while I played the fool. But I wasn't going to be a fool. I was going to be patient. I started documenting everything. I put a voice-activated recorder in Richard's study, another in our bedroom. I installed tracking software on both their phones. There are services that do this if you know where to look and have the money to pay. I created a detailed log of every time they met, every lie they told, every betrayal. I also started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Reynolds, who specialized in trauma and family betrayal. I paid for her sessions in cash and never told anyone about them. She helped me process my rage and pain without falling apart, taught me techniques for emotional regulation, for maintaining a facade. She asked me repeatedly if I was going to confront them, and I always said the same thing, not yet. The hardest part was acting normal around Catherine. She would come over for dinner, hug me, tell me she loved me, ask my advice about work problems or dating issues. Dating issues. She would sit at my table and talk about men she was supposedly interested in while carrying on an affair with her own father. The sociopathy required for that level of deception was staggering. I watched them at family gatherings, observed how they interacted. They were careful, I'll give them that. No obvious touching, no lingering looks in front of others. But I could see it now, the electricity between them, the way they orbited each other in a room. I wondered how I'd missed it before, and then I realized I hadn't really missed it. I'd just interpreted it as a close father-daughter relationship because I couldn't conceive of anything else. Michael and Sarah suspected nothing. Patrick, living in New York, was too far away to notice anything amiss. The grandchildren adored their Aunt Catherine and their Grandpa Richard. Sunday dinners continued as they always had, everyone laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company. Only I knew that it was all a lie, a performance. 3 months after my discovery, I began putting my plans in motion. First, I consulted with a divorce attorney, again paying cash, again telling no one. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state, meaning assets acquired during the marriage are divided fairly, not necessarily equally. With Richard's high income as a cardiologist and my role as a homemaker for most of our marriage, I stood to do very well in a divorce. But I didn't file yet. Because I realized something important. If I filed now, in the heat of discovery, I might get a reasonable settlement. But if I waited, if I let them think they'd gotten away with it, if I let them get comfortable and sloppy, I could get everything. The attorney explained that in Massachusetts, adultery is still grounds for fault-based divorce, which could affect the division of assets and alimony. But more importantly, we could use the affair to our advantage in negotiations. Particularly because the affair was with our daughter, the moral depravity of that would not play well in court if it came to that. Richard would want to settle quickly and quietly to avoid the scandal. So I waited. I continued to gather evidence. I continued to act like everything was fine. And I started making my own preparations for the future I would build without them. If you're still following this story, thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement really helps. I began slowly moving money. Nothing obvious, nothing that would trigger alerts. Small amounts from our joint accounts into accounts Richard didn't know about. I started selling items from the house, expensive items that Richard never paid attention to. A painting here, some silver there. I took jewelry I never wore anymore to a dealer in Providence where no one knew me. Everything went into my secret accounts. I also started building relationships with Richard's colleagues and friends, particularly their wives. I became the sympathetic ear, the woman they could confide in about their own marital problems. I learned which of Richard's partners were having affairs of their own, which were embezzling from the practice, which were cutting corners with patient care. Information is power, and I was building an arsenal. Catherine, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. Her career was going well, she'd been promoted twice. She bought a condo in Back Bay with money Richard had given her. I found the records of that transaction too. They spent weekends there while I was supposedly visiting my sister in Vermont. My sister and I had a good laugh about that when I finally told her the truth years later. She couldn't believe I'd kept it secret for so long. Around the 1-year mark, I started to notice something interesting. The affair was cooling slightly. Not ending, but the frequency of their encounters was decreasing. The texts were less frequent, less passionate. I wondered if the thrill was wearing off, if guilt was finally setting in. But then I realized something that both horrified and amused me: they were getting bored with each other. The forbidden nature of the affair had been part of the excitement. But after a year of sneaking around, it was becoming routine, almost domestic. Catherine complained in her texts that Richard was sometimes too tired. Richard complained that Catherine was demanding too much of his time. They were having the same problems that any long-term couple has, but without any of the benefits of an actual relationship. That's when I made my next move. I started being the perfect wife again. I lost 20 pounds, updated my wardrobe, got a new hairstyle. I started initiating sex with Richard more often, being more adventurous. I made his favorite meals, planned romantic weekend getaways, was attentive and loving. I wasn't doing it to win him back, I was doing it to make Catherine jealous and insecure. It worked better than I could have hoped. Catherine's texts became increasingly anxious. She accused Richard of choosing me over her. She said she couldn't believe he could still touch me after being with her. Richard, confused by my sudden renewed interest in our marriage, tried to reassure Catherine while also enjoying the attention from both of us. He thought he had it all. 2 women competing for him, both beautiful in our own ways, both devoted to him. His ego was inflating daily. And inflated egos make people reckless. They started meeting more openly, taking greater risks. They went to restaurants on the other side of the city where they thought no one would recognize them. They took a weekend trip to New York, supposedly for separate work conferences. Every risk they took, I documented. Every lie they told, I recorded. By the 2-year mark, I had enough evidence to ruin them both 10 times over. But I still wasn't ready. Because I'd realized something crucial. The longer this went on, the more Richard was transferring his assets out of our joint control and into Catherine's name, trying to protect his money from me in case I ever discovered the affair and filed for divorce. He didn't realize that I was documenting every transfer, building a case for financial fraud that would invalidate every transaction. I also started working again. I went back to nursing, doing per diem shifts at a different hospital from where Richard worked. I told him I was bored at home, wanted to feel useful again. He was delighted, said it was wonderful that I was pursuing my interests. Really, I was building my own financial independence and creating a paper trail that showed I was a competent, employed professional, not a dependent housewife. Michael and Sarah had their second child, a little girl they named Margaret after me. I held that baby and cried, and everyone thought it was just grandmother's joy. But really, I was crying because this innocent child was related to people capable of such cruelty, because her grandmother and aunt had betrayed each other in the worst possible way, because her grandfather was a liar and a cheat. Catherine showed up at the christening with a man she introduced as her boyfriend, some banker from New York. I watched Richard's face carefully during the introductions. He was furious, trying to hide it behind a polite smile, but I could see the jealousy burning in his eyes. Later, I heard them arguing in the parking lot. Catherine told him she had to have a cover, she couldn't be 34 and perpetually single without people asking questions. Richard said he didn't care about appearances, he wanted her to himself. The irony of a married man saying that to his own daughter would be funny if it weren't so sick. The boyfriend was just for show, of course. He lasted 3 months before Catherine dumped him. But it had served its purpose. It had shown me that they were both capable of using other people as props in their twisted relationship, and it had made Richard even more possessive and reckless. By year 3, I had a complete financial picture. I knew every account, every asset, every debt. I had copies of everything. I had recordings of hundreds of their meetings, thousands of text messages, photos, financial transactions that showed Richard funneling money to Catherine. I had testimony from several people about times they'd seen Richard and Catherine together in compromising situations, people who owed me favors or who had their own axes to grind with Richard. But more importantly, I had control of myself. The initial shock and pain had transformed into something cold and focused. I could sit across from them at dinner, smile, laugh, make small talk, all while planning their downfall in my head. Dr. Reynolds was concerned about this, said I was compartmentalizing in an unhealthy way. But I knew what I was doing. I was surviving. Around year 4, something interesting happened. Patrick, my son who lived in New York, got engaged to a wonderful woman named Elena. They wanted to get married in Boston, wanted a big family wedding. Catherine immediately volunteered to help plan it, said she'd love to be involved in her brother's special day. I watched her play the devoted sister role and marveled at her acting skills. But planning a wedding meant lots of family time, lots of coordination between all of us. And in those close quarters, with everyone's attention focused on celebration and family unity, Catherine and Richard had fewer opportunities to be alone together. I watched them grow frustrated with the situation. They'd exchange loaded glances across crowded rooms, their texts would complain about not having enough time together. I made sure to volunteer for every wedding planning activity, to be present at every meeting, every tasting, every venue visit. I was the helpful mother and mother-in-law, always there with suggestions and support. But really, I was blocking them at every turn, forcing them apart, watching them squirm. Patrick's wedding was beautiful. Held at the Boston Public Library, 200 guests, everything perfect. Catherine gave a touching maid of honor speech about family and love and commitment. I watched her deliver those words and thought about how easily she lied, how convincing she was. Richard walked me onto the dance floor for the traditional parents' dance, held me close, told me he loved me. I smiled and said I loved him too, and I meant it in a twisted way. I loved what he used to be, or what I thought he was. I hated what he'd become. After the wedding, as year 5 approached, I started the next phase of my plan. I began confiding in certain people. Always carefully, always strategically, about problems in my marriage. Not direct accusations, just hints. I'd mention to Richard's sister that he seemed distant lately. I'd tell my book club friends that I worried Richard was too stressed at work. I'd express concerns to our priest about the state of our marriage. I was laying groundwork, creating a narrative that when the truth came out, people would look back and say they saw signs. I also started building relationships with Catherine's colleagues and friends. I'd take her out to lunch, ask about her work, meet her for coffee. She seemed to appreciate the mother-daughter bonding time, had no idea I was gathering intelligence. I learned about her workplace relationships, her career ambitions, her vulnerabilities. Knowledge is power, and I was becoming very powerful. Meanwhile, Richard was growing increasingly careless. He started keeping a second phone, thought I didn't know about it. But I'd found it within days, had it cloned, was reading every message. He and Catherine were making plans now, talking about a future together. Richard was thinking about leaving me, about starting over with Catherine. They talked about how they'd handle the scandal, how they'd weather the initial storm, how eventually people would accept them because they were clearly meant to be together. The delusion was staggering. They actually thought that people would accept a father-daughter relationship, that society would shrug and move on. They thought their love was special enough to overcome basic human decency and societal norms. The narcissism required for that belief was almost impressive. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think. I'd love to hear your perspective. By year 6, I was ready to start my endgame. But I didn't want just a divorce and a settlement. I wanted total destruction. I wanted them to lose everything: money, reputation, family, future. So I waited longer, let them get even more comfortable, let them make even more mistakes. Richard retired from his practice at 68, selling his share to his partners for a significant sum. That money went into accounts I had access to. He was planning, I later discovered, to give most of it to Catherine, to set them both up for when he finally left me. But he was waiting, he told her in texts, for the right moment. The right moment, apparently, was when I was old enough that he could claim I was senile or incompetent, that his affair was a response to my declining mental state. That particular discovery made my blood run cold. He was willing to destroy my reputation, to paint me as mentally ill, to justify his betrayal. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about systematic gaslighting, about a plan to make me doubt my own sanity. I started recording our conversations, every interaction. I documented every time Richard suggested I was confused or forgetful when I knew I wasn't. I created a detailed mental health journal that showed clear, rational thinking. I had Dr. Reynolds do a full psychiatric evaluation showing I was perfectly competent. I was building my defense against an accusation that hadn't been made yet but that I knew was coming. Catherine, meanwhile, had moved through a series of fake relationships, always introducing some new man to the family before inevitably breaking up with him. She was 38 now, and our relatives were starting to worry about her, asking if she'd ever settle down. She'd tell them she just hadn't found the right person yet, all while sleeping with her own father. I started making plans for after my revenge. I sold some antique furniture that had been in Richard's family for generations, things he told me he wanted to pass down to our children. I told him I'd donated them to charity, and he was too distracted to question it. Really, I'd sold them to private collectors and put the money in my secret accounts. I wasn't just preparing to leave Richard financially comfortable, I was preparing to leave him with nothing. Year 7 brought a health scare. Richard had some chest pains and ended up in the hospital overnight for observation. Nothing serious, just a warning that he needed to take better care of himself. Catherine was there constantly, playing the devoted daughter, holding his hand, bringing him flowers. I watched her performance and realized she actually seemed to care about him, in her twisted way. This wasn't just an affair of convenience or a rebellion against parental authority. She genuinely believed she loved him. That made it so much worse. A simple affair could be blamed on weakness, on temptation, on mistakes. But this was deliberate, sustained, justified in their minds by feelings they called love. They had rationalized and normalized something fundamentally wrong until they couldn't see how sick it was anymore. After Richard came home from the hospital, I started making my own health appointments. Annual physicals, dental checkups, vision tests. I was documenting that I was in excellent health for my age, physically and mentally. No signs of dementia, no cognitive decline, no health issues that would make me vulnerable to claims of incompetence. By year 8, I was ready financially, emotionally, and strategically. But I held back, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when Catherine got a job offer in California, a huge promotion that would require relocating. Richard was devastated. I watched him try to convince her to turn it down, to stay in Boston, to stay with him. But Catherine's career ambitions were stronger than her feelings for him. She took the job. The dynamic shifted dramatically. Now they were facing a long-distance affair, which was complicated for obvious reasons. They couldn't maintain the frequency of their encounters. The texts became more desperate, more angry. Catherine accused Richard of not being willing to sacrifice for her. Richard accused Catherine of abandoning him. It was their relationship at its most toxic, most honest. I encouraged Catherine to take the job, told her it was an amazing opportunity, that she'd regret it if she didn't go. She seemed surprised by my support, maybe even suspicious, but ultimately she listened. She moved to San Francisco, and Richard was miserable. He started drinking more, became morose and distracted. I played the concerned wife, tried to cheer him up, suggested we take a vacation together. He agreed half-heartedly, and we went to Italy for 2 weeks. It was strange, playing tourist with a man I was actively plotting against, but I did it. I took photos of us smiling at the Colosseum, eating pasta in Rome, touring Tuscany. Photos I would later use to show that I'd been trying to save our marriage even as he was betraying me. When we got back, Richard seemed slightly better. He and Catherine were still texting and video calling constantly, but the physical distance had cooled things somewhat. This was my moment. This was when they were most vulnerable, most off balance, most likely to make mistakes. Year 9, I started making my final preparations. I contacted Michael and Patrick separately, told them I needed to talk to them about something serious. I met with each of them individually, without their spouses present, and I told them everything. I showed them the evidence, the texts, the photos, the financial records. I watched their faces as they processed what their father and sister had done. Michael vomited. Actually got sick right there in the restaurant where we were meeting. Patrick just sat in silence for a long time, then said words I'll never forget. He said he always knew there was something wrong with Catherine's relationship with Dad, but he'd never let himself think about what it might actually be. I told them my plan. I told them what I was going to do, how I was going to do it, and when. I gave them the choice to be part of it or to stay out of it. Both of them, loyal sons who were horrified by what their father and sister had done, chose to help me. Michael's wife Sarah, when she found out, was equally supportive. Patrick's wife Elena, being newer to the family, was shocked but understood. We spent months coordinating. Michael worked with my attorney to ensure all the legal pieces were in place. Patrick used his finance background to help me secure all the assets and prevent Richard from moving money around once things went public. Sarah and Elena helped me find and furnish my new townhouse in Cambridge, a beautiful place I bought with the money I'd been secretly saving for almost a decade. By year 10, I was ready. It was December, almost exactly 10 years since that Tuesday in October when I'd watched Catherine walk into my house to sleep with my husband. We were planning our annual Christmas party, a tradition where we hosted both sides of the family and many friends. Over 100 people usually attended, including Richard's partners and their wives, Catherine's colleagues, our extended family, everyone who mattered in our social circle. Catherine flew in from San Francisco for the party. She'd been in California for almost 2 years now, and the distance had changed her relationship with Richard. They still texted and called, but the intensity had faded. She'd even started dating someone seriously out there, a tech executive named David. Richard hated David with a passion that he tried but failed to hide from me. The party was on December 20th. I spent weeks preparing, making sure everything was perfect. The house was decorated beautifully, the caterers were excellent, the bar was fully stocked. I sent out invitations to everyone who mattered, Richard's medical partners and their spouses, Catherine's Boston colleagues and friends, our extended family, our neighbors, our church community. Over 120 people RSVP'd yes. What none of them knew, except for Michael, Patrick, and their wives, was that this wasn't a Christmas party. It was a funeral for Richard and Catherine's reputations. The evening started normally enough. Guests arrived, mingled, drank champagne, admired the decorations. Richard worked the room like he always did, the distinguished retired physician, respected member of the community. Catherine looked beautiful in a designer dress, charming everyone, the successful businesswoman who'd made it big in Silicon Valley. They were the picture of a proud father and accomplished daughter. I played my role too. The gracious hostess, making sure everyone had drinks and food, introducing people who didn't know each other, keeping conversations flowing. I was wearing a red dress I'd bought specially for the occasion, had my hair done, looked better than I had in years. I wanted to look strong for what was coming. At 8 o'clock, I asked everyone to gather in the living room. I said I had an announcement to make, that Richard and I had some news to share. People settled in, expecting perhaps an announcement about a major donation to a charity or plans for a big anniversary trip. Richard looked at me quizzically. This wasn't part of our plan. Catherine looked slightly nervous but tried to hide it. I stood in front of the fireplace, Richard beside me, and I began to speak. I thanked everyone for coming, for being part of our lives, for being our friends and family. I said that the holidays were a time for truth and honesty, for clearing the air and starting fresh. Then I said that I needed to share something difficult, something that had been weighing on me for a very long time. I said that 10 years ago, I discovered that my husband and my daughter were having an affair. The room went completely silent. Richard's face drained of all color. Catherine looked like she might faint. Before either of them could deny it or react, I continued. I told them that I had spent the last 10 years documenting everything. Every meeting, every text, every lie. I had it all. And then I began to share it. I had prepared a presentation, which Michael started playing on our large TV screen. Text messages between Richard and Catherine appeared, explicit ones that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Photos of them together in intimate settings. Financial records showing Richard funneling money to Catherine. A timeline showing the progression of their affair over a decade. The room was in shock. People were gasping, some were crying, several people got up to leave but stayed, too stunned to move. Richard tried to turn off the TV, but Michael and Patrick blocked him. Catherine tried to speak, to defend herself, but Sarah literally told her to shut her mouth. Thank you so much for staying with me through this difficult story. If it resonates with you, please subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world. I continued speaking, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. I explained that I had given them 10 years to come clean, to end it, to show even a shred of remorse or decency. They hadn't. Instead, they had continued to betray me, to use me, to plan a future that involved painting me as mentally incompetent to justify their relationship. I revealed the recordings I had of Richard discussing with Catherine how they would claim I was senile, how they'd get me declared incompetent, how they'd move me into a nursing home so they could finally be together openly. Listening to those recordings, hearing Richard coldly plan to institutionalize me when there was nothing wrong with me, was the final straw for many in the room. Several of Richard's medical partners stood up and left immediately. One of them, Dr. Harrison, who'd been Richard's friend for 30 years, stopped on his way out to tell Richard he was disgusting and that they'd be discussing his behavior at the next partners' meeting. Richard's sister, who'd worshipped her brother her whole life, looked at him with utter revulsion and told him their mother would be ashamed. Catherine's colleagues and friends were equally horrified. Several of them came up to me to apologize for not seeing what was happening, to express their disgust at her behavior. Her best friend since college, Amanda, told Catherine she never wanted to see her again and walked out. But I wasn't done. I then revealed the financial fraud. I showed documents proving that Richard had been systematically moving marital assets into Catherine's name over the past 10 years, trying to hide money from me in preparation for when he'd eventually leave me. I explained that every one of those transactions was illegal, that it constituted financial fraud, and that I had already filed documentation with the appropriate authorities. Richard finally found his voice, tried to defend himself, tried to explain. But what can you say when the evidence is so overwhelming, so damning? He tried to claim it wasn't what it looked like, that the messages were taken out of context. But how do you take, "I can't wait to make love to you tomorrow while Mom is at her book club" out of context? Catherine tried a different approach. She broke down crying, saying she was sorry, that she never meant for it to happen, that she'd been confused and vulnerable. But then I played a recording from just 3 months earlier where she told Richard she'd never loved anyone the way she loved him, that what they had was real and pure and worth any sacrifice. Her crocodile tears dried up pretty quickly after that. The party, obviously, ended. People left in groups, whispering, shocked, some angry at Richard and Catherine, some angry at me for airing family business so publicly. I didn't care. This wasn't about maintaining appearances anymore. This was about justice. After the last guest left, it was just me, Richard, Catherine, Michael, Patrick, Sarah, and Elena. I told Richard and Catherine that I had filed for divorce that morning, that the papers would be served officially after Christmas. I told them that I was seeking everything, the house, the retirement accounts, the investments, everything. And because of the adultery, because of the financial fraud, because of their plan to have me declared incompetent, my attorney was confident I'd get it. I told Catherine that I had also contacted her employer, providing them with evidence of the affair and the financial fraud she'd been complicit in. That conduct violations of that nature, especially involving financial impropriety, would likely result in termination. That her career in consulting was over. Richard tried to threaten me, said I'd regret this, that he'd fight me on everything. But I reminded him that I had enough evidence to destroy him completely. That if he fought me, I'd make sure every medical board in the state knew about his conduct, that I'd contact every patient he'd ever treated, that I'd make sure his reputation was demolished so thoroughly he'd never work again. Catherine tried to appeal to my motherly instincts, said I couldn't really want to do this to her, that she was still my daughter. I looked at her and said she stopped being my daughter 10 years ago when she betrayed me in the worst way a daughter can betray her mother. That I had mourned her long ago. That the person standing in front of me was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Michael and Patrick told their father and sister that they were done with both of them. That their children would never know them. That as far as they were concerned, they no longer had a father or a sister. Richard tried to appeal to them, but Patrick said something that summarized it perfectly. He said that Richard had destroyed their family for selfish gratification, and that there was no coming back from that. I left that night. I walked out of the house I'd lived in for 40 years and moved into my new townhouse in Cambridge. I never went back. Michael and Patrick helped me move my remaining possessions over the following weeks while Richard was staying at a hotel. I didn't take everything. I left him enough furniture to live, enough dishes to eat off of. I wasn't cruel about the physical items. But I took everything that mattered to me, and I took all the financial assets I was entitled to. The divorce took 6 months to finalize. Richard tried to fight it at first, but his attorney advised him to settle when he saw the evidence I had. We divorced on grounds of adultery, and I received 70% of our marital assets, the house in Brookline which I immediately sold, and substantial alimony. Richard was left with his medical pension and not much else. Catherine was fired from her job 3 weeks after the party. The company couldn't be associated with someone involved in that kind of scandal, especially given the financial fraud aspects. She tried to find another position in her field, but the story had spread throughout the consulting community. She was essentially blacklisted. Last I heard, she was working in some administrative role, making a fraction of her former salary. The relationship between Richard and Catherine didn't survive my expose. Once the affair was public, once they couldn't sneak around anymore, once they had to face the judgment and disgust of everyone they knew, the thrill was gone. They tried for a few months to make it work, to actually have a real relationship, but it fell apart. Turned out that shame and social ostracism aren't great foundations for a lasting relationship. Richard tried to reconnect with Michael and Patrick, but they refused. He sent cards to his grandchildren that were returned unopened. He showed up at Patrick's house once and was told to leave or the police would be called. He died 3 years ago, at 78, essentially alone. Michael and Patrick didn't attend his funeral. Neither did I. Catherine tried to reconcile with me several times over the years. Letters, emails, showing up at my door. Each time, I refused. She'd cry and apologize and say she understood why I was angry but hoped I could forgive her someday. I'd simply close the door in her face. There is no forgiveness for what she did. There is no redemption arc for that kind of betrayal. Some people think I was too harsh. That I should have handled it privately, that I shouldn't have destroyed them so publicly and thoroughly. These are usually people who've never experienced that particular brand of betrayal, who don't understand that some violations are too fundamental to forgive or handle quietly. I don't regret a single thing I did. Every step of my revenge was calculated and deserved. They took 10 years of my life, made me live in ignorance and humiliation while they betrayed me. I took 10 years planning their destruction, and I executed it perfectly. My life now, at 75, is peaceful and happy in ways it never was during my marriage. I have wonderful relationships with Michael and Patrick and their families. I see my grandchildren regularly. I volunteer at the hospital where I used to work. I have friends who respect me and a life that belongs entirely to me. People ask me if I'm lonely, if I regret not having a partner in my old age. I tell them that loneliness is being married to someone who's betraying you, who's planning to have you committed so he can be with your daughter. Loneliness is sitting at Sunday dinner with your family while 2 of them are lying to your face. What I have now isn't loneliness. It's peace. To anyone reading this who's experiencing betrayal from family members, I want to say this: you don't have to forgive them. You don't have to take the high road. You don't have to maintain relationships with people who've devastated you just because you share DNA. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to cut out the cancer, even when it wears a familiar face. My revenge took 10 years, but it was worth every second. They thought they'd gotten away with it, thought I was too weak or too stupid or too devoted to ever fight back. They were wrong. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. I'm Margaret, called Maggie by those who love me. I'm 75 years old. My daughter slept with my husband. And I destroyed them both, methodically and completely, in exactly the way they deserved. I regret nothing. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Thank you.